remember the cold. That's what stays with me most, even now. Not the bodies, not the shelling, not even the smell of promethium mixed with rotting flesh, though the Emperor knows that scent worked its way so deep into my skin, I tasted it in my sleep. No, it's the cold I remember. That specific cold that comes from standing waist-deep in frozen earth while the wind screams over fortifications built before my grandfather's grandfather drew breath. The kind of cold that starts in your fingers and works inward like a slow poison, settling in your chest, your gut, your thoughts. Cold that makes your teeth ache. Cold that turns your sweat to ice in the creases of your joints. Cold that whispers that you've always been frozen, that warmth was something you imagined in a fever dream, that this numb, grinding existence is all there ever was and all there ever will be. They assigned me to the burial details when I was 14 standard years old. I remember the administratum clerk who processed my work requisition, a hunched woman with augmetic eyes that clicked and whirred as she scanned my identification chip. She didn't look at my face, just the data slate, her fingers dancing over keys worn smooth by countless other assignments, other lives sorted into columns and categories. Grave Services, Section 97, Trench Line Secundus, she said, her voice flat as sheet metal. Report to Overseer Health at 0600. Emperor protects. The words were rote, meaningless. A blessing delivered with all the warmth of a servitor's mechanical genuflection. I didn't know then what those words meant. Grave Services, Trench Line Secundus. I learned. The fortress world I was born on had no name I ever knew. We called it the world, or sometimes here, or most often nothing at all, because what need was there to name a thing when it was everything and everywhere, when there was nothing else to compare it to? I learned later, much later, from a half-mad Vox operator whose mind had cracked during an artillery barrage, that it had an official designation, Fortress World Kappa 17 Tertius, Fourth Line Defense, Segmentum Obscurus. The words meant nothing to me then. They mean less now. What matters is what it was, rockcrete and iron, trenches that stretched from horizon to horizon, bunker complexes buried so deep you could walk for hours through lamplit corridors and never see sky, gun emplacements the size of hive blocks, razor wire in coils thick as a man's torso, minefields that went on for kilometers, and above it all, the walls. The Emperor's own walls, we were told, blessed by tech priests and cardinals, inscribed with prayers in high Gothic that nobody I knew could read, studded with cannons that could punch through a tank's armor at 10 kilometers. And the graves, always the graves. The fortress world existed to hold a line. What line against what enemy I never fully understood. The overseers said we stood against the enemies of mankind. The traitors and Xenos and worse things still, horrors that had no names, because to name them was to invite damnation. I believed them because there was nothing else to believe. Every few months, sometimes weeks, sometimes days, the sirens would howl and the artillery would start up, a thunder that shook the bedrock itself, and the reports would filter down through the command structure to the labor battalions. Enemy sighted, enemy engaged, enemy repulsed. Bodies to collect, Section 83. Mass casualties, trench collapse, Section 41. Prepare burial pits, grid coordinates following. We did what we were told. We always did what we were told. My first day in Grave Services, Overseer Health took me to the edge of Pit 71. I remember him clearly, a massive man, shoulders like a blast door, face weathered into leather, hands scarred from decades of handling corpses and shovels and the frozen earth itself. He'd lost an eye in some accident nobody talked about, the socket covered, with a crude patch of tanned hide. His remaining eye was gray as gunmetal, and when he looked at me, I felt weighed, measured, and found acceptable, only because I had a heartbeat. and 2 working arms. "You'll start on sorting duty," he said, his voice a rumble from deep in his chest. "You see bodies come in. You check for identification tags. Tags go in the left bin. Personal effects, aquilus, prayer strips, anything that ain't fused to flesh, go in the right bin. Everything gets catalogued. Administratum needs numbers. Numbers keep the machine running. You understand?" I nodded, though I didn't understand, not really. He must have seen the confusion in my face because he hawked and spat into the pit, a glob of yellow phlegm that disappeared into the dark. "You'll learn, boy. Or you won't, and you'll end up down there with them." He gestured to the pit, and I made the mistake of looking. I can still see it. The pit was perhaps 30 meters across, excavated by servitors and labor crews over the course of weeks, a perfectly circular shaft descending into the bedrock. The sides were sheer, reinforced with rockcrete, and at the bottom, I couldn't see the bottom, not really. Just a darkness that seemed to writhe and shift, a suggestion of pale shapes and darker hollows. The smell rose from it like something alive, a reek of decay and lime and disinfectant that didn't disinfect so much as add another layer of wrongness to the stench. I gagged, and Halth laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "You'll get used to it," he said. "Month from now, you won't even notice. Year from now, you won't remember what anything else smells like." He was right. The work was simple in the way that all labor is simple, repetitive, mindless, soul-killing. Bodies came in on conveyor carts pulled by servitors, stacked like cordwood, wrapped in whatever scraps of canvas or plasteel sheeting could be spared. Sometimes they came in fresh, still warm, blood leaking through the wrappings to pool on the cart beds. Sometimes they came in frozen, limbs jutting at unnatural angles, faces locked in expressions of shock or agony or blank, empty nothing. Sometimes they came in pieces, sorted by the medics into bags marked left arm, torso section, unidentified fragments. My job was to unwrap them, check for tags, those small metal rectangles stamped with a serial number and affixed to a chain around the neck or wrist, and search for personal effects. Most had nothing. The soldiers on a fortress world didn't accumulate possessions. They had their armor, their weapons, their ration chits, and little else. But occasionally I'd find things, a pressed flower, gone brown and brittle, tucked into a boot, a photograph, the faces blurred and faded, of people I would never know, a rosary made of spent bolter casings, each one inscribed with a tiny prayer, a letter, never sent, the paper water-stained and smudged, confessing love or fear or some desperate hope that whoever read it might remember that the writer had existed, had felt, had mattered. I catalogued them all, dropped them into the right bin, and moved to the next body. Sometimes 100 a day, sometimes 500. Once, after a particularly brutal assault that broke against the western fortifications like a wave against a seawall, we processed over 3,000 in a single 40-hour shift. I stopped counting. Halth was right about that too. You get used to anything if you do it long enough. The mind builds walls, fortifications of its own, and after a while the bodies stopped being people and became objects, problems to solve, tasks to complete. Tag, effects, next. Tag, effects, next. The rhythm of it became a kind of prayer, a litany that filled the hours and kept you from thinking too hard about what you were doing or why. But the cold never stopped. That was the thing. You could get used to the smell, the sight, the feel of dead flesh under your fingers, skin gone waxy, muscles stiff and unyielding, bone that cracked when you moved it wrong, but you couldn't get used to the cold. It was always there, a presence, an entity that lived in the trenches and the pits and the wind that howled down from the mountains to the north, Mountains I never saw, but whose existence I felt in every gust that cut through my work fatigues and settled into my marrow. In the deep winter months, and winter on that world lasted 9 months out of every standard year, the cold became a physical weight. Your breath froze in your lungs, your eyelashes stuck together when you blinked. The corpses came in so frozen that touching them barehanded left your skin adhered to theirs, and you had to pour boiling water over the contact point to separate, leaving patches of your own flesh behind like grotesque stigmata. I learned to wear gloves, thick ones, rated for void work, scavenged from a dead engineer whose body had come through 3 months into my tenure. His hands had been crushed, the gloves intact, but filled with a red-black slurry that I dumped into the pit before claiming them as my own. Nobody said anything. On a fortress world you took what you could. Survival wasn't about following rules. Rules existed, certainly. Endless reams of regulations handed down from the administratum, protocols for everything from body disposal to ration distribution to proper hymnal recitation during work hours. But survival was about the small thefts, the unspoken agreements, the knowledge of when to look away and when to take what you needed before someone else did. The grave pits themselves were marvels of logistics, if you thought about them, which I tried not to. Each pit was excavated to precise specifications, 30 meters diameter, 50 meters depth, walls reinforced and treated with antibacterial agents that did nothing against the smell, but satisfied some regulation somewhere. When a pit was full, and they filled quickly, bodies packed in layers separated by thin spreads of lime and rockreet. Dust, it was sealed. Servitors would roll in massive slabs of ferrocrete, each one inscribed with the pit number and the date of sealing, and a prayer to the emperor asking for his mercy on the souls interred within, and these slabs would be lowered into place by crane. Then the sealing crews would come with their welding torches and bonding agents, fusing the slabs into a single, unbroken cap. On top of this, a thin layer of soil would be spread, and a marker post driven in, a simple iron pole with a plaque listing the pit number and the estimated number of dead. Estimated. Because we didn't always know, because sometimes bodies came in so mangled, so mixed together, that counting them was guesswork. An arm here, a torso there, a skull crushed to fragments. How many men was that? 2? 3? The administratum demanded numbers, so we gave them numbers, but they were lies built on approximations, built on prayers that nobody was checking too closely. And maybe they weren't. Maybe somewhere in a hive city 1,000,000 light-years away, some clerk was entering our figures into a cogitator, watching the columns add up, nodding in satisfaction that the emperor's tithe of blood was being properly accounted for. Maybe. Or maybe the numbers went nowhere, meant nothing, were simply another ritual we performed because the alternative was admitting that none of it mattered, that the dead were dead, and the counting was just something to do with our hands while we waited for our own turn in the pits. I worked sorting duty for 2 years, 730 days give or take, though the world's rotation didn't match standard imperial calendar, and nobody bothered explaining the conversion. Time stopped meaning much after a while. There was work, and there was sleep. And there was the thin grey space between them where you ate your rations. Corpse starch, probably, mixed with fungal protein and whatever chemical binders kept it from falling apart, all of it tasting of nothing, or of everything, or of the cold itself. And you sat with the other grave workers in the barracks, and you didn't talk because what was there to say? Sometimes someone would receive a letter from somewhere, and they'd read it aloud, and we'd listen to news of worlds we'd never see, of families we didn't have, of lives that seemed as alien and distant as the stars themselves. Sometimes someone would start singing old work songs or half-remembered hymns, and the rest would join in. Voices rough and tuneless, but it was sound. human sound, and for a few minutes the cold would recede and we'd remember that we were something other than meat waiting to be catalogued. But mostly there was silence, the kind of silence that presses in on you, that fills your ears with the sound of your own blood moving, your own heart beating, the small wet sounds of your body simply existing. And underneath it, always, the wind. The fortress world's wind was a constant, a presence you learned to navigate like a sailor learns currents. It came from the north, screaming down across the mountains, picking up speed across the open ground between trench lines, slamming into the fortifications with force enough to knock a man down if he wasn't braced. It carried sounds with it, the distant crump of artillery, the scream of jets overhead, the crack of las fire from sections kilometers away, and sometimes, if you listened carefully, voices, screaming voices, praying voices, voices calling for help that would never come, that had never come, that had been dead for hours or days, but the sounds somehow lingered in the wind, echoes trapped and carried and released at random, like ghosts that didn't know they were supposed to stay buried. I tried not to listen to those voices. Some of the other workers claimed they could understand them, that the wind carried messages, warnings, prophecies. A man named Greven, who worked the eastern pits, swore he heard his dead brother in the wind one night, calling his name, telling him to run, to get off the world before it was too late. He tried, went mad or mad enough, and made a break for the transit stations in the fortress core. The Arbites caught him 3 kilometers from the work site, brought him back in chains and hanged him in the central yard as an example. We were all required to watch. His body swung there for a week before someone, I never knew who, cut it down and brought it to us for processing. I found the tags. I catalogued the effects, one boot, left foot, the right having been lost somewhere during his flight, a ration chit with 3 meals remaining, a scrap of paper with a child's drawing, stick figures holding hands under a yellow sun. I dropped them in the bin and moved to the next body. You get used to anything. In my 3rd year, they moved me to excavation duty. The sorting crew was overmanned, Halth said, and they needed bodies, living ones, he clarified with that grinding laugh, for the dig teams. New offensive to the south, he explained, big push, command expected heavy casualties, and we needed to prepare. 6 new pits, each one standard specification, to be completed within a month. I was issued a shovel, a pick, a breather mask that didn't quite seal properly around my face, and a set of coordinates. The work was harder, physically, than sorting. You spent your shifts in holes in the ground, chipping away at frozen earth and bedrock, while servitors hauled away the debris in buckets chained to pulley systems. The augmetic laborers were stronger, faster, more efficient, but there weren't enough of them. There were never enough of anything on a fortress world. So they supplemented with us, with human labor, with the warm bodies that could be spent and replaced and spent again. The earth itself was strange. The topsoil, what little there was grey and lifeless, contaminated by centuries of war. Nothing grew on the fortress world, not naturally. The administratum shipped in rations from agri-worlds whose names I never learned, worlds where the sun was warm and rain fell and crops grew in colors other than grey. I couldn't imagine such places. They seemed like myths, like the emperor's paradise that the preachers promised awaited the faithful, the ones who served without question and died without complaint. Below the topsoil was bedrock, dense and dark, shot through with veins of strange minerals that glittered in our lamplight. Some ore, I assumed, some resource that had made this world worth fortifying in the first place, though nobody ever confirmed that and I never asked. You didn't ask questions. Questions implied that you thought you deserved answers, that your understanding mattered, and that was the kind of pride that got you noticed. And being noticed meant being moved, reassigned, sent somewhere worse. There was always somewhere worse. We dug in teams of 20, working in shifts that lasted until the pit was done or until someone collapsed, whichever came first. The cold down in the holes was different from the surface cold. Deeper, older, like the earth itself was dead and frozen, and we were digging through its corpse. My hands blistered, healed, blistered again, until they were more callous than skin. My shoulders ached constantly, a dull throb that never quite went away, that followed me into sleep and made rest impossible. I lost weight I didn't have to lose, my body consuming itself for fuel, burning through muscle and fat until I was little more than wire and bone held together by stubbornness and fear. Fear of what would happen if I stopped. Fear of ending up in the pits I was digging, catalogued and filed and forgotten. The servitors were worst during excavation duty. They worked alongside us, tireless and silent, their augmetic limbs pistoning in perfect rhythm, their organic parts, where they still had them, long since dead to sensation or thought. Some had been criminals, I'd heard, sentenced to servitorization for crimes against the Imperium. Others had been volunteers, though what would drive someone to volunteer for that fate I couldn't fathom. Most, I suspected, had simply been unlucky, in the wrong place when the Mechanicus needed parts, swept up and processed and reborn as machines that wore the shape of men. They didn't speak, didn't react, didn't acknowledge our existence except to avoid colliding with us as they worked. Once, a servitor's power pack malfunctioned during a shift, and it collapsed mid-swing, its excavation claw burying itself in the pit wall. We stood there for 10 minutes, waiting for it to restart, before an overseer came down and declared it beyond immediate repair. They hauled it out with chains, and I watched its face as it passed me, that slack, empty face with its vacant eyes and its jaw hanging open just slightly, and I wondered if there was anything left in there, any spark of whoever they'd been, any awareness of what they'd become. I still wonder. The offensive came 4 months later. We heard it before we saw it, a rumbling that started low, subsonic, a vibration you felt in your teeth and your gut before your ears registered it as sound. Then the artillery opened up, and the world became noise. I'd heard bombardments before. Everyone on a fortress world had, but this was different. This was sustained, apocalyptic, a thunder that went on for days without pause. The ground shook. Dust sifted down from the bunker ceilings. We kept working because there was nothing else to do, filling the pits we dug with the bodies that started coming in almost immediately. The wounded went to the Medicae stations, the ones who might be salvaged, but the dead came to us, and they came in numbers that exceeded even the most pessimistic projections. We worked around the clock, no shifts, no breaks, just continuous labor as the carts kept arriving, kept unloading, kept going back for more. I stopped cataloging properly. There wasn't time. Tags went in one bin, effects in another, but I didn't check them, didn't sort them, just grabbed and threw and moved on. The pits filled faster than we could seal them. We started stacking bodies above ground, in the open, covered with tarps that the wind tore away, exposing them to the elements and the scavenger birds that had appeared from somewhere, black shapes that circled overhead and descended in clouds when we weren't looking. We threw stones at them, fired las pistols into their ranks, but they kept coming because there was too much food, too much death, and they were only doing what nature designed them to do. The smell became unbearable. Even the cold couldn't suppress it entirely. The disinfectants we used ran out, the lime ran out. We burned incense, thick ropes of it that smoldered and sent up black smoke that stung the eyes and throat, but it did nothing. The smell was inside us by then, in our lungs, our blood, seeping from our pores. We smelled like the dead. We were death, living death, walking corpses performing our function until our own time came. It was during this period that I first heard the singing, not the work songs, not the hymns, but something else, a low, droning sound that seemed to come from the pits themselves, from the bodies packed within. At first I thought it was the wind, playing tricks, finding cavities in the stacked dead, and producing sounds the way a flute produces music. But it was too regular, too rhythmic, too much like voices. Other workers heard it too. We didn't talk about it, but I'd see them stop, cock their heads, listen. Halth, when I finally worked up the courage to mention it, spat and said it was nothing, just our minds cracking under the strain, that everyone heard things eventually, saw things, felt things that weren't there, and the only cure was to keep working, keep moving, keep your hands busy and your thoughts buried. But the singing continued. And after a while, I realized I could almost make out words. Not high Gothic, not low Gothic, not any. Language I recognized, but something older, something that felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The kind of wrong that made your spine crawl, that made you want to run even though there was nowhere to go. I started volunteering for excavation duty again. Anything to get away from the pits, but the new holes we dug were too close to the sealed ones, and the sound carried through the earth, through the stone itself, vibrating in the bedrock like the planet was singing along. The offensive ended after 6 weeks. Command declared it a victory, a successful repulsion of enemy forces, though what forces and how many, and at what cost, I never learned. The bodies stopped coming in such numbers. We caught up, sealed the pits, planted the markers, and went back to something resembling routine. But something had changed. I could feel it in the other workers, a brittleness, a fraying at the edges. People stopped talking almost entirely. Fights broke out over nothing, a misplaced tool, a bump in the corridor, a look held too long. 3 workers from the southern section simply walked off into the minefields one night, hand in hand, and didn't come back. Nobody went looking. Nobody said anything. We just absorbed their duties and kept working. I was promoted to overseer the following year. Halth had died. Heart failure, they said, just collapsed during a shift and never got up, and they needed someone to take his place. I didn't want it. The thought of responsibility, of making decisions, of being the one who assigned duties and enforced discipline filled me with a sick dread. But you didn't refuse a promotion. Refusing meant demotion, and demotion in grave services meant the pits. So I accepted, and they gave me Halth's quarters, a small room, private, with an actual door that closed, and his slate, filled with schedules and requisition forms and casualty reports that I didn't read because reading them meant acknowledging the numbers, and the numbers were too high too. Constant, too inevitable. As overseer, I had access to records I hadn't seen before, reports from the Fortress Command, casualty projections, strategic assessments. I learned that the Fortress world was dying. Not in the way that all things die slowly and naturally, but systematically, deliberately bled out over centuries of constant warfare until there was nothing left but the fighting itself. The population was declining. Not from the battles, those casualties were expected, accounted for, absorbed by the Imperium's vast machine, but from attrition, from the slow grinding down of bodies and minds until even the ones who survived stopped reproducing, stopped caring, stopped believing that there was any point in bringing children into a world that existed only to feed them into trenches and graves. I was 24 standard years old when I understood, truly understood, that I would die on that world, that there was no rotation, no reassignment, no retirement, that the Fortress world was a cage, and grave services was a cell within that cage, and I had been locked inside from the moment that Administratum Clerk processed my work requisition. The knowledge sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold, and I carried it with me through the days and the shifts, and the endless procession of bodies that never stopped, never slowed, never gave any indication that this was anything other than eternal. The singing from the pits grew louder, Or perhaps I simply became more attuned to it. I started hearing it in my quarters late at night, when the wind died down and the fortress was as quiet as it ever got. A low drone, barely audible, rising from somewhere below, from the hundreds of sealed graves that stretched out across the burial grounds like a city of the dead. Sometimes words would emerge from the drone, fragments of sentences in that wrong language, and I would lie awake trying not to listen, trying not to understand, because understanding felt dangerous, felt like it would open something inside me that I couldn't close again. Other overseers felt it too. We'd gather sometimes in the administrative bunker, ostensibly to coordinate schedules and share resources, but really just to be around other people who understood, who'd seen what we'd seen, who carried the same weight. An older woman named Siobhan, who ran the eastern sections, told us she'd started dreaming of the pits. Not nightmares, she clarified, her voice hoarse from breathing in lime dust for 3 decades. Worse than nightmares, just being in them, being under them, packed in with all the others, staring up at the sealed lids, waiting. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Waiting for what? They're dead. We're going to be dead. What's there to wait for? Nobody answered, because we all knew we were waiting for the same thing the bodies were waiting for it to end, for the fighting to stop, for the emperor or the enemy or the universe itself to decide that this world had given enough, had bled enough, had sacrificed enough. But that decision never came. The war went on. The bodies kept coming, the pits kept filling. I began walking the burial grounds at night. I told myself it was to inspect the sites, to check for structural problems or scavengers or any of the 100 small issues that could arise, but really it was because I couldn't sleep, and lying in my quarters listening to that singing was worse than being out in the cold. The grounds stretched for kilometers in every direction, a landscape of marker posts and sealed ferrocrete caps, each one a tomb for hundreds or thousands. The posts were arranged in grids, numbered and logged, a perfect example of imperial efficiency, but walking among them at night, with only a lamp pack for light, and the wind howling and the stars hidden behind perpetual cloud cover, they looked like nothing so much as tombstones in a graveyard too large to comprehend, monuments to a futility so vast it became almost beautiful. Beautiful. I don't know why I thought that, but I did. There was something almost transcendent about it, about the sheer scale of death, the recognition that all of this, the labor, the cataloging, the careful numbering and filing, was ultimately meaningless, a gesture against entropy, a refusal to let the dead become nothing even though they were already nothing, had always been nothing, had died for reasons they didn't understand in a war they couldn't influence for an imperium that didn't know their names. And yet we kept doing it, kept digging the pits, kept sorting the bodies, kept planting the markers, because what else was there? To stop would be to admit that it was all pointless, and that admission would crack something fundamental in the mind, would let in the kind of despair that turned men into the walking dead long before their bodies caught up. I was 32 when the first grave opened. I wasn't there when it happened. Overseer Marcoon found it during a routine inspection, a crack in the ferrocrete seal of Pit 43, one of the older burial sites, sealed nearly a decade before I'd even started in grave services. The crack was small, he said, no wider than a finger, but it shouldn't have been there at all. The seals were rated for centuries, designed to withstand ground shifts and temperature changes, and anything short of a direct artillery hit. We reported it to the tech priests, filled out the requisition forms for repair materials, and waited. The materials never came. Too many other priorities, the administratum said. Too many fronts demanding resources, too much war everywhere all at once. They told us to monitor it, to report any changes, to seal it with whatever we had on hand if it worsened. It worsened. Within a month, the crack had widened to the span of a hand. Within 2, it had split the seal nearly in half, and from it, smells emerged that were worse than decay, worse than anything I'd encountered in my years handling the dead. A sweetness, cloying and thick, mixed with something chemical, something that burned the back of your throat and left a taste like copper and rot. The singing grew louder near pit 43, no longer a drone but distinct voices, dozens of them, hundreds, overlapping and harmonizing in that wrong language, and when you got close enough, when you stood at the edge and looked down into that crack, you could see movement in the darkness below. We sealed it with rockcrete slurry, pouring it into the crack until it overflowed, and for a week we thought that would be enough. But the slurry cracked too, the new material splitting along the same lines as the old, and the crack opened wider, and now it was big enough that we could shine lamps down into it and see what was underneath the seal. I wish we hadn't. The bodies were moving, not decomposing. That would have been natural, expected, horrifying but comprehensible, but moving, shifting, rearranging themselves in the packed mass, limbs extending and retracting, mouths opening and closing in time with the singing, empty eye sockets turned upward toward the crack as if watching us watch them. I stood there for 10 minutes, maybe more, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing, trying to fit it into some framework that made sense. Gases, I thought, decomposition gases causing the bodies to shift, creating the illusion of movement. But gases didn't explain the singing, didn't explain the coordination, didn't explain the way they seemed to be reaching for us. We brought in a tech priest, a junior one, barely more than an initiate, because that was all we could get. He performed his scans, his rituals, his consultations with whatever machinery lived in his skull, and then he left without saying a word. His report, delivered by Servo Skull 3 days later, recommended immediate incineration of the entire site, sealing the remains in consecrated lead, and a full purge of all personnel who'd been exposed to the pits. Contents. The recommendation was filed, logged, and ignored. Incineration required fuel we didn't have, lead we didn't have, and purging personnel meant losing experienced workers we desperately needed. So instead, we welded a steel plate over the crack, bolted it down with anchors driven deep into the bedrock, and tried to pretend it hadn't happened. But other pits began to crack. Pit 18, Pit 97, Pit 234, old pits, new pits, pits that had been sealed for decades and pits that had been sealed for months. The pattern made no sense, fit no logical progression. The tech priests claimed it was ground instability, but the fortress world's crust was stable, had been stable for millennia, and their scans showed no evidence of seismic activity. The preachers claimed it was divine judgment, the emperor's wrath manifested, punishment for sins we didn't remember committing, but their prayers and blessings did nothing to stop the spread. And all the while the singing grew louder, more insistent, voices layering upon voices until it was no longer confined to the pits but filled the air itself, a constant background hum that you couldn't escape, that followed you into the barracks and the mess halls and your own thoughts. Workers started disappearing, not dying, death we could account for, process, catalogue, but vanishing. They'd go out on a shift and never return, and when we searched for them, we'd find nothing, not bodies, not signs of struggle, just empty trenches and abandoned tools, and sometimes, if you looked carefully, footprints leading toward the burial grounds that simply ended, as if the person had been plucked from the earth mid-step. We reported it, filled out the forms, requisitioned replacements, and kept working because what else could we do? I stopped sleeping entirely. The singing in my quarters had become words, clear and distinct, and though I still didn't know the language, I understood them on some level deeper than meaning. understood them in my bones and my blood. They were calling, inviting, promising rest, true rest, the kind that came from letting go, from joining the chorus, from descending into the cold and the dark and the packed earth and becoming part of something larger than yourself, something that would never end, never change, never demand anything except your voice to add to theirs. It would be easy, I thought. So easy. Just walk out to one of the cracked pits, climb down into the opening, let the earth close over you. No more cold, or rather cold so complete it became warmth, numbness so total it became sensation. No more bodies to catalogue, no more reports to file, no more pretending that any of this mattered. Just the singing, forever. I wanted it. The Emperor forgive me, I wanted it more than I'd ever wanted anything, but I kept working. Day after day, shift after shift, as the cracks spread and the pits opened and more workers disappeared and the singing grew so loud that conversations became impossible, we just worked in silence, communicating through gestures, through the shared understanding of people trapped in the same nightmare. The administratum kept sending requisitions, kept demanding reports, kept insisting that everything was proceeding according to regulation, and we kept responding, kept filling out the forms, kept lying because the truth, that the dead were waking, that the graves we dug were releasing their contents, that something fundamental had broken in the machinery of death itself, was too vast, too absurd, too heretical to commit to official record. The assault came without warning, not an enemy assault, those, we would have heard, would have had time to prepare for, but an assault from below. The ground itself split open in a dozen places, ferrocrete seals shattering, and from the opened pits came, I don't have words for what came out. Bodies, yes, but bodies that had been changed, reformed, fused together into structures that defied. Anatomy, limbs sprouting from torsos, faces emerging from backs and chests and thighs, all of them singing, all of them moving with a terrible coordination toward the bunkers, toward us. We fought. Of course we fought. We were still human enough for that, still retained enough instinct for survival to grab whatever weapons we could find. Shovels, picks, the lasguns that a few overseers kept locked in their quarters for discipline enforcement, and we fired, we swung, we killed things that were already dead, that had been dead for years, that kept moving despite missing heads and limbs and chunks of their fused masses, and all the while they sang that dreadful harmony, and I realized with a horror that went beyond fear that they were singing to us, about us, that we were part of the song, had always been part of the song, that our cataloguing and filing and careful numbering had bound us to them in ways we hadn't understood. The Fortress Command responded eventually. They sent troops, sanctioned soldiers with flamers and heavy bolters, and they burned the burial grounds, burned everything, reduced the opened pits and the things that emerged from them to ash and slag. The singing stopped. The cracks sealed or were sealed, buried under new rockcrete and steel and prayers, and we survivors, there were 43 of us left from a workforce of 300, were interviewed, debriefed, assessed for contamination and heresy and whatever else the inquisitorial agents who arrived 3 weeks later decided to look for. They found nothing, or nothing they admitted to finding. We were issued new identification, new work assignments, new quarters in a different section of the fortress, as if putting distance between us and the burial grounds would make us forget what we'd seen, what we'd heard, what we'd almost become. Most of the survivors requested transfer to other duties, gate guard, manufacturing work, anything that didn't involve the dead. Their requests were granted. I didn't request transfer. I don't know why. Perhaps because I knew it wouldn't matter, that wherever I went on that fortress world, I'd still hear the singing, still feel the pull of the cold earth, still know that my name was already written on a marker post somewhere, waiting. They assigned me to a new grave detail. The war hadn't stopped. The bodies kept coming. New pits needed digging. New casualties needed cataloguing. And grave services was undermanned, always needing more workers to feed into its own grinding machine. I accepted the assignment, reported for duty, picked up a shovel that felt both alien and familiar in my hands, and I began digging, the earth cold and hard beneath me, the wind screaming overhead, and somewhere, deep below, I swear I could still hear them singing. That was 5 years ago. Or 10, or yesterday. Time doesn't work right anymore. The days blend, the shifts extend. The cold has worked so far into me that I can't remember what warmth felt like. Can't remember my life before the pits. Can't remember if there was a before at all. I dig. I sort. I catalogue. I watch the new workers arrive, young and scared, and still believing that they're different, that they'll survive, that this won't break them the way it broke everyone else. I want to warn them, want to tell them to run, to refuse the assignment, to accept whatever punishment comes because nothing could be worse than this. But I don't, because they wouldn't listen, and because I'm not certain anymore that there is anything worse than this, or anything better, or anything else at all. The singing never truly stopped. That's what I've learned. It's always there. Just below the threshold of hearing, waiting. The pits are sealed again, new seals rated for 1,000 years, blessed by higher-ranking tech priests and cardinals, who flew in from off-world specifically for the consecration. But I walk the burial grounds at night because I still can't sleep, and I hear them down there, calling, waiting, singing their song that's somehow about duty and death and the Imperium and the cold, always the cold that seeps into everything and everyone and makes us all the same in the end. Sometimes I stand at the edge of the newest pit, the one I'm currently digging, and I look down into the darkness, and I think about how easy it would be to just step forward, to let gravity take over, to fall into that cold embrace and let someone else catalogue my tags, file my effects, drop me into the frozen earth with all the others, to finally rest, to add my voice to the chorus and never have to dig another hole or unwrap another body or pretend that any of this matters. But I don't step forward. Not yet. Because there's still work to do. There are always more bodies coming, always more pits to dig, always more numbers for the administratum, more markers to plant, more seals to pour. The machine needs us, needs our hands and our labor, and eventually our corpses to feed into the same ground we've spent our lives preparing. It's efficient when you think about it. Brutally efficient. We dig our own graves one shift at a time, and when we finally fall in, we become part of the foundation for the next generation of workers who'll do the same on and on, until the war ends, or the world ends, or the Imperium ends, or time itself stops, whichever comes first. I think the cold will outlast them all. I think the cold will be there at the end of everything, singing,